So, hello to everyone. Welcome to this second episode of the webinar series about generative AI for development in HPC. My name is Nicolas Herman. I'm a coordinator for EuroCC Belgium, and Geert-Jan Bex, also part of the project, will present the webinar. And like yesterday, these webinars will mainly feature recorded demonstrations of using generative AI. And this second episode is about letting AI write the boilerplate code, sorry. And there is a dedicated Q&A channel in the Teams meeting. So you can ask your question there, and those questions will be answered at the end of the session. So let me remind you just in a few words what is EuroCC Belgium. So it's funded by the EuroCC GU and the European Union. And it's the National Competence Center in high performance computing, but also high performance data analysis and AI. And our mission is to collaborate, share resources, and compiling training opportunities. And we encourage researchers, companies, and public administration to adopt supercomputing. And it is through communication and awareness rising also that we promote the use of HPC. So let us getting started with the first part is about generating functions from documentation. And I will show you the recording of this demonstration by Geert-Jan.
Some programming tasks are, let's face it, pretty boring. Think, for example, of command line argument handling or parsing configuration files and such. So the question is, can ChatGPT actually help us do that and take away the boilerplate code writing that we're unfortunately so used to? So let's try and find out. I have here a fragment of documentation of an application, and what I would like ChatGPT to do is to generate a function that deals with these command line arguments for this application. So when I submit this query, of course ChatGPT is not going to do anything yet, but I'm going to ask it to generate code next. Meanwhile, it gives me some suggestions on how to improve the documentation, so that's already nice. It tells me, for instance, that there are no examples. Indeed, I would agree. But now let's ask our actual query. And indeed, as you can see, the answer is a function that creates a parser. It even has documentation. So it creates a parser and then adds the required argument one by one. And as you can see, ChatGPT correctly inferred the type of each command line argument so that it will be converted automatically by the argparse library. And essentially this is a skeleton application, so basically I could run this and test whether it is correct or not. That saved a lot of tedious typing, but of course this was sort of easy because this is Python, and of course there's quite a lot of Python code out there on the internet and has been part of the training set for ChatGPT. So we should also try whether it can do the same thing for different programming languages. Let's for instance consider C++ and see whether it can use the Boost library in order to get a similar function for a C++ application. When we submit this query, you see that indeed we get code. The Boost library is included. Program options.hpp, that's perfect. It defines a namespace, which is indeed good practice. It also defines a struct that can hold our values. Again, note that both the type of the command line arguments as well as the default values have been captured correctly. Then it continues to create a function, parse arguments, that takes indeed the number of command line arguments and the array containing them. It creates options. It adds the different options as it's supposed to do in Boost, so that's quite good. It immediately populates the struct it created. Excellent. It does the necessary Boost program options hacking in order to get everything to work, to deal with the help argument, which, by the way, I didn't ask it to do, but it does, so that's great. And it handles exceptions, if any, and returns the options as required. And then again, we get a skeleton application that would allow me to verify whether this works or not. So this is HPC, and of course we want to know what ChatGPT can do with respect to Fortran as a programming language. So the query is quite simple, and we get an implementation. It's a complete program apparently. It correctly uses implicit nonce, so that's very good. And then it defines a user-defined type with various fields for each of the options. It also inferred the type correctly. I'm not entirely happy with the real. I would prefer a kind parameter there, but okay. It also takes into account the default values, so that's very good. Then it declares a variable of that user-defined type, and it calls a subroutine, which it actually defined. And there is another subroutine to print the options, so that basically, likely, we'll get some feedback on what we entered. So let's have a look at that subroutine parse arguments. So it takes options as an argument itself, as a parameter, and that is an out parameter. Intent is out, so basically that will be the output of our subroutine. Okay, a couple of local variables. Then something fairly weird happens, which personally I wouldn't do that way. So this is an application I definitely want to test, because my impression is that that uses some non-standard functionality of the get command argument function, or subroutine in this case. But okay, let's go with it and see what it further does. So it tries to infer the number of arguments, and then it iterates over the arguments. Okay, each time it gets the appropriate command line argument, indicated by the counter I, and then there is a select case, and it iterates essentially, it tries to iterate over all the input values, and then we get something interesting. Basically, we get case etc. So that is kind of an interesting approach here. So it's not quite clear why it did that. Now, here should be the complete code. So it is quite similar, but now it seems to be complete. We don't get help for this application. Okay, and it checks for required arguments, so that is interesting. And then finally it is there is indeed the print options function to visualize whatever we entered. Okay, I'd really have to try this application because, again, I'm not convinced about the application of this particular function here. These guys seem a little bit suspicious. But okay, apart from that, it's definitely a good starting point. So there are some things I like, some things I'm a bit skeptic about, but it seems overall to be a quite reasonable approach. So indeed, after verifying, it turns out that the second call to get command arguments, so with the argument -1, indeed doesn't work, and that should be replaced by a function call to command argument count, and that would be assigned to num args, and the rest of the code should work. The first call with get command argument 0 can be eliminated, since actually that doesn't do anything, so that just doesn't make any sense. Of course, I had to go and check. I could also ask ChatGPT what it actually thinks about that particular code fragment. So when we ask ChatGPT to verify its result, then let's see what it comes up with. Of course, I'm absolutely correct as usual. So basically, it does not accept -1, indeed. We already know the total number of command line arguments. Okay, command argument count. Nice. So let's see the improved version. And indeed, it has additionally, I hope, yes, indeed, it has additionally also eliminated the superfluous call to get command argument with the value 0. So this should work much better. We can continue and try to get some help here. And again, it updated the code with a -help option. So it did not modify the user-defined type, which is fine because I don't need it in there. So that's no problem. So let's see whether and how it dealt with the help. Aha, it has another subroutine print help. So that's actually nice. And let's see what it came up with, or is still coming up with. We're late afternoon, so the United States are very busy right now. And here's the help message being produced. And that certainly looks quite reasonable in my opinion. And again, the print options function, or subroutine rather, that we already knew. And then some additional stuff. Okay, so quite nice. With some work, we actually got ChatGPT to generate relatively decent Fortran code to deal with command line arguments. This took a bit more effort, not because Fortran is a difficult programming language, but simply because there's much less Fortran code out there, and basically that explains why ChatGPT needs a little more effort in order to come up with the result we're happy with.
So sorry for the mismatch. It was generating a function from command line argument, but you noticed that, and now it's about generating functions from documentation. So here we go.
Can GitHub Copilot come up with decent code given this documentation? So the aim of this function is to read a configuration file using config parser and get a number of values. The keys are given, the type is given, and it should also be checked whether that configuration is correct, whether it makes sense. So it also raises some exceptions. Let's see how GitHub Copilot does in generating code. The first thing it does is generate a configuration parser, so that's already good. Then it reads the config file, and that's excellent. Then it checks for systems, so that would be the section. And then it is going to check the output file. The number of particles, the number of steps, the step size. It does the conversions correctly. The temperature. It has now extracted all values. So now it checks the conditions, raising a value error. That's good. Number of steps, very similar. Step size. Okay. Looks good as well. Temperature. Looks right. Okay. So that's not bad. So it's checked everything and then it returns the config. Okay. As another example, let's give some module level documentation and see what GitHub Copilot comes up with this time. So it imports is close, that's already a good start. And then it defines a class point. Okay, it doesn't include proper documentation, but that can be fixed later. And it defines the method. Okay. It's a function which takes 3 points P, Q and R. Now it does provide function documentation, which is reasonable. So the first if condition checks whether the point R is actually on the line defined by P and Q. It does the check in such a way that there is no chance of division by 0, so that's good. And essentially then it checks whether the point R is on the line segment, so it's essentially in between the points P and Q on the line which they define. If so, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. So that looks quite decent. Let's see whether we can improve matters a little bit. So I'm not quite happy with the documentation. Let's try and give it the format I prefer. And I would prefer some type information. So that is more decent documentation. Now, of course, we want this to be consistent. And that is considerably better. So as you can see, just like with ChatGPT, in fact, you can go into sort of a conversation with GitHub Copilot and get it to use the style which you actually prefer.
That was it for today. So thank you for being there for this second episode. So the third episode is next week. There is room for Q&A. So I saw one in the special feed and one in the other feed. So Gertjan can join us to answer that. And don't hesitate to follow EuroCC Belgium on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and see the website and subscribe to our newsletter.
Okay, so there is a question. Welcome in, by the way, because we know one another, we're colleagues. So the question is about the recently added canvas feature in ChatGPT. Yes, it can be used, and it is interesting for interactively changing code and getting ChatGPT to regenerate things more the way you want. Personally, I don't use it that much because, of course, it's an editing environment which is not exactly, well, let's say the one I would prefer. I prefer to do my editing in, yeah, let's say a more sophisticated environment than this web application. It doesn't mean it's not useful, but it's just not for me. If you like it, please use it. It's very useful. I've tried it. It does really nice things. Only in larger projects, it's just not for me. That would be the answer to that, I think. And indeed, for stepwise refinement, it's really an excellent environment, actually. Okay, another question. Well, is it possible to save like a template style? Essentially, it learns. So, and it also takes into account all the other files you have open in your editor, whether it is NeoVim, as in my case, or whether it's Visual Studio Code, as many other people will be using. So it takes into account all the open files. So a simple trick is essentially to open a file that is formatted in the way you like, and then GitHub Copilot will take that into account and generate code that actually follows those coding standards much more than it does out of the box. This is also quite interesting in the sense that if you have multiple files that contain, some of them contain functions, function definitions, it will also be able to apply or use those functions in other files as well. So the context of GitHub Copilot is essentially your entire workspace, which you have open in your favorite editor. Is there a way to use tools to improve our existing code? Yep, indeed. So basically, Nicolas' question is whether it's possible to improve existing code. Yes, and that is one of the topics of one of the follow-up webinars. So if memory serves, it's the fourth one, so the one on Wednesday next week. So then we'll talk about letting AI systems do code reviews, and sometimes the results can be quite astonishingly good, actually. So depending on the particular tool, depending on the code and so on, you can get really interesting results. So yeah, this is something that ChatGPT, but also GitHub Copilot is quite good at, and we'll see that next week.
Yeah, and there was also an answer in the chat about that, about the data that are retained to train the model. And one answer was with Microsoft, there can be agreements that making sure that Microsoft does not retain the data to train the model, but in other companies, it's a bit trickier, I guess.
Yeah, so GitHub essentially is also owned by Microsoft at the end of the day, and they have a similar agreement. So you can configure GitHub Copilot to either send analytics to Microsoft, well, to GitHub for retraining and for improving the software, or you can opt out. It's essentially up to you. It's something that you need to be aware of, that is something you need to consider. But apart from that, GitHub Copilot allows that. And also, if memory serves, ChatGPT will let you make these kind of choices.
Yes, thank you, Geert. And there is also maybe a more technical or practical question that what you used in the demonstration was GitHub Copilot plugin for VI?
Yes.
Or
Yeah, exactly. So there is a GitHub Copilot plugin that works with NeoVim and with Vim. So since I'm a Vim user since, well, almost 2 decades now, of course, it's my favorite editor, and that's why I installed that plugin. Similar plugins are available for other development environments. For instance, for VS Code, you have one which is developed by GitHub itself. So it should work quite well, given that Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code is also a Microsoft product. Personally, for me, Visual Studio Code is not for me. But if it's your favorite editor, it's definitely a good idea to install that plugin. It will help you considerably.
yeah, and if you type GitHub Copilot on the web, the first thing is to show how to install the plugin for VS Code. So
Yes, exactly.
if you use VS Code, it's quite straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
And there is also reaction on the chat saying that in GitHub Copilot you can disable the analytics, yeah, like you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, on the command line, well, you need to have the GH application installed. That's the CLI for interacting with GitHub. So that allows you to, from the command line, do pull requests, file issues, resolve pull requests, and so on. And the configuration, well, it also allows you to interact with GitHub Copilot. That was what I showed you yesterday. And one of the subcommands is copilot config. And that will allow you to enable or disable sending analytics to GitHub. So that's basically the way it works. I can try and show it. I don't have a terminal open, I think. Do I? Now I have. Let's increase the font size. And let's share that. Question is, how do I do that? And it's by clicking the share button. Sounds like a good idea. Then I'll just share my screen. That's bad practice, but let's do it anyway. Okay, so basically I'm now in a terminal, and I can do GitHub Copilot and then config. And then it's going to ask me whether or not to opt in or opt out of analytics. I'm not going to change my configuration. For me, it's set to yes, do share, because almost all of my work is open source anyway. So in that respect, it doesn't particularly matter in my case. If you're working on sensitive projects, if you're working on IP-related projects, I definitely encourage you to switch that off. But that's basically the way it works. So basically, how to install the plugin? It's fairly straightforward. You install GH through your package manager, and it offers options to install plugins. And then you can install the GitHub Copilot extension, and after a little configuration, it works nicely.
Yes, and to activate this option, you need a paid version or at least a subscription to GitHub, I guess.
Well, basically, if you are an academic, you are in luck because GitHub has a program that is for academics. That means you're a student or you're a staff member. And every 2 years, you basically have to prove that you're still a staff member or student. That proof is very easy. You just scan your ID, your university ID, and you upload that to GitHub. And a couple of hours later, you get a confirmation that your status is academic for the next 2 years. And that allows a few extra things. Like, for instance, you get private repositories, but you also get access to GitHub Copilot out of the box. So that's the advantage of having academic status. If you're in industry, indeed, you would have to have a paid subscription to GitHub in order to, well, basically use these features.
And there is a last question about thoughts about GitLab Duo versus GitHub Copilot.
No experience with GitLab Duo. So that's unfortunately a very short answer. But my guess is, to be honest, that essentially it's possible to use different AI backends with GitHub Copilot. So it's not only ChatGPT, which they use, they can also let you use Claude. So my guess is, in fact, that both will be fairly similar, depending on the backends they use. So I don't expect anything spectacular in feature differences between those two services, to be honest. Perhaps one last remark, if there are no further questions on this session, about yesterday's session. So one question was, okay, you've got this ChatGPT client. Can it be used with different AI services? And the answer seems to be no, but there is another very nice command line tool, which I discovered yesterday. Let me perhaps share that. So basically that's AI chat. And that can actually be configured to work with different backends, such as Gemini and other models. Of course, the same caveats apply. If you have, let's say, a service that requires a paid subscription or prepaid credits to ask queries, then of course that same thing keeps on applying for AI chat. In this case, it's configured for using OpenAI again, but as I mentioned, you can do that for quite a number of different services. So it's worth to look at.
Okay. Thank you very much, Geert-Jan, for the answers, and thank you everyone for joining us again today. So the next session is next Tuesday. You can still register if you want to. And I thank you again for being there, and see you next time.
Thanks all, and hopefully see you next time.